or two because, as you heard, it discussed the issue of slavery and trafficking from the top and the bottom. We heard about some of the data, some of the work that Verite has done looking at a particular industry and the prevalence of forced labor at almost an individual level. And then with Steve, we came and went all the way to the top, where you basically have white-collar crime, people with the banking industry who are profiting often greatly from the work of the people that Verite has been documenting, but are so far away from it that they don't feel that they're tainted by it. And I think that's a very helpful point of entry for our discussion, kind of bracketing the problems of slavery and trafficking. I've been working on human rights in this part of the world for quite some time, for human rights NGOs. And I actually came to this discussion really to learn and to see where the state of play is. And by the end of the day, I find myself generally optimistic, more optimistic than I had thought. And a lot of that is because of what's happening in ASEAN. ASEAN integration in some shape or form, we don't know exactly what it will look like, but it is happening. ASEAN is developing economically, and ASEAN has an opportunity that is very rare, which is the ability to shape its own community and to shape its legal framework. And that's something that means that it should be learning from the lessons of other parts of the world. There are, of course, significant things to worry about. We heard from our colleagues and friends at the ILO and at the IOM about the very dangerous prevalence of trafficking in this part of the world, and in particular trafficking for forced labor. ASEAN is interesting in that way because the majority of the people who are trafficked are involved in forced labor. And that goes to one of the weaknesses of ASEAN, namely that there are tremendous economic disparities. We have Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, to some extent now, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines growing, and then we have countries, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, who are struggling. Vietnam is not coming up. We have tremendous income disparities in ASEAN. And this also means that the temptation for, as we heard, for migration is very high. Now this is something that can be good or bad. It means that within ASEAN, we have tremendous need for labor, and we have tremendous number of laborers. And so if ASEAN can get this right, it means that within ASEAN, at least the issue of forced labor can be addressed, and the needs of both the sending countries and the receiving countries, to some extent, addressed. Now, there are questions about the economic value of this and so on and so forth. One thing to start with, and just to point out, we're talking about slavery and trafficking. I just want to remind everyone that slavery is the original internationally recognized human rights violation. This was recognized as a human rights violation along with piracy. Slavery is an international crime. No conventions have to be signed, although they are. Slavery anywhere in the world is a violation of international law. Every government everywhere in the world has the obligation to fight people who are engaged in slavery and piracy. And this has been true now for 150 years, almost 200 years. So now, forced labor is a particular modern manifestation, probably not modern, but it's a particular manifestation of that. And I think as a global community, we've decided that we don't like forced labor. Trafficked forced labor is a subset of that. And that's where, as we heard from Steve, the issue of criminalizing trafficking has come in. So on the one hand, we have slavery, which is an international crime. The jus cogens, for those of you who are lawyers, this is a crime that is accepted under common international law. And now, very recently, over the last 10 years with the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, trafficking for forced labor is also another is a recognized international crime. And so, again, this requires a response, as we heard, at the top and at the bottom. At the bottom, it's crucial to identify who has been subjected to forced labor, who is suffering from forced labor. That's something that I think we will keep hearing about, and that's a particular weakness within ASEAN, within Asia. It's a weakness everywhere in the world, but just looking at ASEAN, the number of labor inspectors is particularly low. I think that's true in a lot of the developing world. But looking at the top, it's also true that there are particular problems in terms of regulating the banking industry, regulating the networks that allow trafficking to take place. What's particularly interesting about forced labor and trafficking for forced labor is that unlike trafficking for sexual exploitation and prostitution or organ donations or obviously for the trafficking of children, which are drug trafficking, which are effectively almost everywhere in the world inherently criminalized, forced labor is a shadow of the legitimate legal economy. And so forced labor's fruits have to very quickly enter the legitimate money trail. And that's very different from drug trafficking or from prostitution. And that's, again, where what Steve has talked about is particularly important, I think, for ASEAN and for the member states of ASEAN, because they have the chance, as they look at integration, to make sure that their banking regulations, that their transnational and national banking regulations are able to regulate and to look at the fruits, the profit from trafficking for forced labor. That's a great advantage, and that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic. As we heard a bit earlier from colleagues working on CSR, for instance, businesses themselves understand that they're under consumer pressure to do this, but frankly, they need to come under regulatory pressure. I say that because the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime is different from a lot of other international documents because it specifically addresses legal entities. And that's a step forward. That's a very important step forward. Governments that sign on to this convention agree that they will start looking at corruption, at money laundering, and at the activity of legal entities. Legal entities are businesses and banks. And this is something when the ICJ has discussions with corporations or with bankers for that matter, sometimes we have to remind them, there is no God-given right to profit. Profit is not a human right. And that's an important thing to remember. Anything that's bigger than a family business, any business entity, any bank, is a legal creation. So its job is to maximize profit within a legal framework. And that means that governments have all kinds of ability to control that legal framework. And we already agree that slavery is something that's bad and unacceptable. And I think the question now for ASEAN as it looks into integration is, how will it begin to regulate its own legal entities? And how will it create a legal framework? This is a hugely interesting time to be having this discussion in ASEAN because ASEAN's economic value, economic development is very quick. It's been mind-boggling for people who've worked in this region just to see how fast ASEAN has grown. And that means that a lot of ASEAN entities, a lot of ASEAN businesses are now competing at the global level. Western companies have come under pressure for CSR for quite some time. Western consumers, Western media are really involved in CSR. There are even avenues for legal action. I think for Asian companies that are now hitting the global stage, the temptation is to always compete on the bottom, to try to undercut the prices of Western competitors, and the temptation to do that by engaging in cost-cutting measures like forced labor is very high. And I think this is the moment for ASEAN to say, okay, we're not going to compete like that. We're not going to compete by engaging in activity that are international, that are recognized as violating international law and our international crimes. And I think the difficulty now and the challenge for all of us here is to make that discussion in ASEAN a reality at the national level and at the regional level. And I say that again because it's clear that within ASEAN there are very different constituencies. So based on just what we heard though, I think all of the constituencies, all of the stakeholders in ASEAN, and let's face it, ASEAN is still very much a state-driven organization, to get the attention of the ASEAN governments, we heard today both sides of it. On the one side, the governments that are benefiting from sending their labor aside, we saw some of the numbers in terms of remittances, which are still very important for the Philippines, for Cambodia, for Myanmar. It's going to be increasingly important. Those governments should want their laborers to have better treatment and to be able to send back more money and to work with more dignity. Nobody wants to have their nationals be known as the bottom, unprotected layer of the global market. And I think for those governments, there has been some interesting developments. I think, for instance, from the government of the Philippines, which over the last 15, 20 years has really pushed for greater rights for its people. And I think there, they need to be working, those sending governments need to be working very closely with organizations like Verite to document what's happening. It shouldn't be the U.S. State Department or U.S. Labor Department that's paying for this. It should be ASEAN governments that are paying for this research. On the other side, and particularly the issue becomes Singapore, Malaysia, to some smaller extent Brunei, which are going to be the future investors, the future bankers within ASEAN, to put this pressure on them. Singapore, frankly, has a fantastic reputation for a strong rule of law system and strong anti-corruption system, especially within its judiciary, but it does a very, very poor job of documenting exactly where the profits that are entering into it are coming from. And when we see this, is that a lot of companies that are trying to avoid international sanctions and moving into Myanmar are now registering in Singapore. And that's frankly not something that the Singaporean government should be allowing to happen. They should do a much better job of regulating the kind of money that's coming into the Singapore economy. To some extent, I would say, I think Malaysia and now Thailand, as they develop their stock exchanges, will also have this. This is not just because it's nice, it is, and it's not just because it's a human right, which it is, but this is now something which has teeth, which is that American and European investors, and more particular stock exchanges and regulators, will demand that. And so that means for the first time there's actually an enforcement mechanism in that too. So again, to me, this is the moment, this is the right moment to be engaging ASEAN as an institution and the ASEAN states on this issue. And so what is it that we're looking for ASEAN to do? And I'll end with some quick thoughts about where ASEAN is on this issue and on human rights in general. ASEAN's record on human rights is not fantastic. The ASEAN countries as a whole fall below the rest of the regional organizations around the world in terms of signing on and enforcing international law on human rights, by far. And that's actually just not sustainable anymore. So one of the problems that we have in ASEAN is that the work with regulators, the work with monitors in the NGO world, with the media, is not supported. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What we see, just to give you a few examples, is that journalists who are documenting and following trafficking in Thailand face libel prosecutions. activists who are monitoring the conduct of companies in the fishing industry face libel prosecutions. And that goes to this very odd and old and, again, unsustainable existence of criminal defamation laws in the ASEAN countries. Simply removing the constraints on NGOs and media will go a long way toward addressing the monitoring and lack of information that we talk about trafficking and slave labor. And then the issue is, which is huge and which ASEAN has not dealt with, is how do you handle transnational access to justice? We at the ICJ have engaged with ASEAN on this for some time. What happens when an Indonesian truck driver drives into Malaysia, hits someone, and then drives back to Indonesia? Where can that lawsuit be brought? This is not a human rights issue. This is the simplest kind of transnational corporate challenge that will come up. And frankly, ASEAN as a secretariat, ASEAN as an institution, and the ASEAN member states have done a very poor job of addressing that. So much less the questions around access to justice. ASEAN, one of its strengths is the diversity of beliefs and languages. One of its weaknesses is the diversity of beliefs and languages. And that means that people who come from one ASEAN country to another ASEAN country have a great deal of difficulty in terms of accessing any kind of protection because very often they don't speak the language. And so that goes to questions of access to justice, translation, legal aid. Again, these are questions that ASEAN has to address. ASEAN has begun to look at some of these questions with its Declaration on Human Rights. Ambassador Manalo is here. I have to repeat once again the ICJ's long-standing criticism and problem with that document, which is as a model, and we're now looking ahead to a convention on forced labor on trafficking within ASEAN. These documents benefit from consultation with stakeholders. They benefit from transparency, and most of all, they have to be added values. We heard again this morning a quick discussion about what will happen with this convention that ASEAN is looking at. ASEAN already has signed on to a lot of the relevant treaties. So there is no point to an additional regional convention unless it's better. Our fear is that, in fact, there will be attempts to weaken the existing obligations, which is legally dubious, but could happen. So at this moment, with all of you here, I think it's an important moment to work with ASEAN and with member states in terms of looking at that convention as a moment to bring together stakeholders, all of the stakeholders that we've heard, banking regulators, labor inspectors, NGOs, journalists, businesses, of course, and the governments to discuss how best to handle this issue within ASEAN. How can organizations like Verite or Liberty Asia and NGOs like that essentially institutionalize their work across the region and ensure that ASEAN now comes up with a convention that is state-of-the-art and that can be a model for the rest of the world in terms of how ASEAN deals with the problem of forced labor and trafficking for forced labor. ASEAN really does have the opportunity to get this right. And so I hope, and I'm optimistic today at the end of the session that maybe we can do that.